my great pleasure to be able to welcome as our speaker tonight, Wesley Granberg-Michaelson. Wesley Granberg-Michaelson is the former Secretary General of the Reformed Church in America, where he served from 1994 to 2011. He has also served as the Director of Church and Society for the World Council of Churches, and he is the founder of two ecumenical organizations, the founder of the Global Christian Forum, and also the founder of Christian Churches Together. We are extremely honored to be able to have Wesley Granberg-Michaelson speaking to us tonight. Applause doesn't work very well in the online avenue, but I'm applauding you and very, very grateful for your time. Please give your full attention to Wesley Granberg-Michaelson's remarks.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, and thank you all for joining in this way. It is a real honor to be with some old friends and with new friends, including ones whose work I know of and respect so much. I thank you for that psalm, Jonathan, and it reminds me that this is one of the Psalms of Ascent. It was one of the Psalms that the people of Israel would sing as they made their way up to Jerusalem on pilgrimages. And one of the fervent features and hopes that we see in the Old Testament and in these pilgrimages is the desire for unity. We sometimes think that the call to Christian unity is rooted in one or two proof texts in the New Testament, and nothing could be further from the truth. This is a theme that runs throughout Scripture, and you've picked one of the Psalms that, in fact, displays that hope in a very powerful way within the experience of the people of Israel. You have distributed to you a copy of the things I want to share. I'm going to be using that as the basis for my time. I do want to add a few things, particularly around the first sentence, where I say the growth of world Christianity in the global South continues faster than existing ecumenical structures can respond and adjust. I think most of us on this call are aware of the realities of the growth of Christianity in the global South. Gina Zerlo is one of the experts. Brian Stanley is at Edinburgh, which produced the tremendous atlas of global Christianity and continues to do so much to show what's really happening. Briefly, for the students, in 1980, for the first time in 1,000 years, the geographical center of global Christianity shifted out of the north. This map that you now see before you on the screen displays this reality in a more vivid way than any other thing I know. Some of you have seen this, but I want to simply use it as a quick tool to demonstrate. This shows the geographical center of Christianity at any point of time in Christian history, meaning the point on the map where an equal number of Christians are found to the north and the south, in the east and the west. As you can see, for the first 1,000 years of Christianity's life, that geographical center was found in the Near East area, between Jerusalem, where Aaron is, and up to Constantinople. In fact, interestingly, in the year 1000, the geographical center of Christianity was located more or less right at Constantinople. But then, as Christianity grew, that point began to move west and north, so that in 1500, it was at its most northerly point in what today is Budapest, Hungary, as we think about the way Christianity then was expanding into Europe. But from 1500 onwards, it begins to move to the west. As you think about the colonial expansion of European countries, and with it, the accompanied expansion of Christianity. So that by the 1900, that center still found itself in Spain. It was still in Europe, but it had moved that far to the west. Now, from 1910 until 2010, the geographical center of Christianity makes the most dramatic shift in all of Christian history, moving rapidly to the south, so that by 2010, that center is around what today is Timbuktu, and then continues to move to the south and also to the east, as you think about the expansion of Christianity also in Asia. That gives the geographical picture of what is happening. The two major stories I want to highlight are, first, the growth of Christianity in Africa, which I think historians will say is one of the astonishing features of Christianity in its more modern history. In 1900, only 2% of Christians were found in Africa. By the time we reach the year 2025, 5 years from now, 40% of all Christians will be African. I was in Lagos in August, and when we were driving through town, my host said, we have a little exercise here. If you look at the buildings that we pass, 1 out of 10 is a church. I did not believe them until I started observing and counting. And in fact, they were about right. But most of these churches were small storefront churches, the Apostolic Mission, the Church of the Universal Christ, the Church of the Spirit's Joy, etc. But you can see this expansion of Christianity in Africa when anyone is present, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. The other story is the growth of Pentecostalism. That is the other major story of modern Christian history. We trace the Pentecostal movement, at least those of us in North America, roughly to Azusa Street in 1910. In a little more than a century, its growth has been astonishing. Even in 1970, only 5% of Christians self-identified as Pentecostal. Today, 600 million do. 1 out of 4 Christians today will self-identify as Pentecostal or charismatic. And I did some statistics that maybe even Gina doesn't have yet. I can actually offer a statistic back to the best resource I know. I did the math and figured out that 1 out of 12 people alive today in the world self-identifies as Pentecostal or charismatic. Those two trends I just want to lift up at the beginning of our time. Now, my first point is that ecumenically, and I know the term ecumenically is loaded for some, others prefer Christian unity. We're going to just use the term ecumenical as the search biblically for Christian unity. The ecumenical challenge precisely comes today that the churches that are growing the fastest tend to have the weakest ecumenical connections, or the weakest institutional or historical connections to the search for Christian unity. I mentioned those particularly as Pentecostal communities, evangelical, African instituted churches, independent churches, the growth of independent churches. Gina's Center with Todd Johnson and others have recently traced that trend in very helpful ways. That's where much Christian growth is coming. But the churches that have supported the infrastructure of ecumenical movements are largely the historic Protestant and Orthodox churches, and those churches, by and large, struggle to maintain a witness within their own countries. So in a way, that really crystallizes the challenge that we face, because if we believe, as I do, that the search for the unity of Christ's body is not something optional, not something that happens at just a spiritual level, but a deeply biblical command and injunction, we've got to ask what initiatives today are possible and fruitful. Now, let's focus this a little more to how this happens in the digital age, which is the framework for our time. And this is really a challenge, because historically, the efforts towards Christian unity have revolved around face-to-face meetings. And it has often been said that Christian unity really happens as people have gotten to know and encounter one another personally. But are there ways in the digital age in which the gifts of this communication can create new methods of ecumenical engagement? And if so, what might that look like? Now, I've had an idea for a while that I actually wrote about it in my last book. I mention it often in lectures, and I keep throwing this out, hoping that someone will either say that's a brilliant idea or that is absolutely stupid, stop talking about it. So I'm going to try it again today. I've thought a lot about Facebook, which is a social media platform that I happen to use. Any of you can find me there, I will friend you. But it creates these possibilities of virtual community. And so I've wondered, would it be possible to create a similar social media platform that we could call Faithbook, and that it would be a platform where Christians could come from all variety of backgrounds and find the means to relate, to friend, to engage in dialogue, to form subgroups, and to have a virtual platform that allows the kind of interaction that we need on such a wide level. Now, I know there'd have to be a lot of protocols established. There'd have to be questions like, well, who gets in and out? Is this just Christian? What about interfaith? What, et cetera, et cetera. But I really wonder if something like that is worth exploring, and if there's somebody who knows a whole lot more about how these, what these digital platforms look like under the hood, who could say, now, this is something we should do or not. I have a second idea that I want to propose for Christian unity in the digital age, and that comes back to the importance of face-to-face encounters. And most people, I know, Jonathan, you do all kinds of online teaching now. The seminaries in the Reformed Church of America, when I was General Secretary, we moved them towards online education. But the principle was always online education is a wave of the future. It's essential, but it's got to be supplemented with times of face-to-face encounter. You've got to have a mix. Now, some of you are more expert in this than I am, but I've thought about that. And I've thought about and observed these various forms of international youth gatherings. I've been astonished at the way the Catholic Church is able to have an International Youth Day about once every 3 years. It was started by John Paul II, and they get between 500 to 1 million young people to come and attend. The last event was in Panama, and last year, 720,000 were present. And this to me is really remarkable. the Evangelical Alliance and my friend Bishop F. Has started something similar. He tried to have a global youth day in August. Maybe some of you were there in the Philippines. It got about 50,000, and they had a lot of virtual sites around the world. I've been at the Taizé community in France, and I've been astonished to see how that community draws young people in this. And this is interesting. It draws young people in this digital age into times of silence. I mean, I've seen young people on retreat there in the Taizé worship being silent for 10 minutes, and I've wondered if they've been silent for 10 minutes all their life. But they are really drawn to that. And so my thought is, why couldn't we have a global gathering that wasn't in these separate pillars, but brought all these groups together? And why couldn't the Vatican and the World Evangelical Alliance, the Pontifical, the Council of the Vatican, the Pentecostal World Fellowship and the World Council of Churches all jointly support that? And that's not, that's not so outlandish, because those four groups are the four pillars of the Global Christian Forum. They already work together and cooperate with one another on an equal footing. And those are the main Christian families: the Catholic, the Evangelical Protestant, and the Pentecostal, and in the mainline, mainly in the WCC with the Orthodox. And then I focus a little more. Some of you are familiar with the Global Christian Forum. Others, it's probably new. I know a couple of you, including Gina, were at our last global gathering in Bogota. I think this is a marvelous initiative, and it's got a tiny budget. We've got a new General Secretary, Kingsley Esamoah from Ghana. And in this, I'm really wondering, is there a larger role that this instrument can play? Because one of its priorities is to figure out how to have a deeper engagement of youth. We've got a pretty static website. We've talked about doing things electronically, but is there a challenge here? And what about other ecumenical organizations? Can they be brought into a similar conversation? Then I would move to my final points, and this becomes a little more controversial, I think, but biblically, Christian unity is never for its own sake. It is always for the sake of demonstrating God's love between people that then flows out from them to the world. And you see how this happens. You see this in verses. You see this in the history of the ecumenical movement itself. People are drawn to be one in Christ in order to strengthen the witness of Christ in the world today. So the question that often happens, especially in new forms, when we think about in the digital age, or when we think about gatherings like the Global Christian Forum, if I talk to a younger generation, and several of you of that generation are listening into this lecture, and say, here's the challenge of Christianity to become one, biblically, they will say, well, what for? I mean, what's the outcome? What's the effect of that? And it's a legitimate question. But it's hard to, what do? Do you get everyone to agree on some social issue, or everyone to agree on a common form of evangelism, or what? Well, the thought I have had in the last couple of years is that Christian unity and witness can be a counter sign to the rise of authoritarian leaders and regimes around the world today that are supporting themselves through various forms of narrow nationalism and racial bigotry, often authoritarian moves against their population, against migrants, and so forth. There are numerous examples. And the thing to remember is that the call to unity in Christ is a call that reminds us that the gospel of Jesus Christ can never be captive to any particular national ideology. And that's why it is so important. It's been important historically and it's so important today for Christians from different countries and national settings to be in fellowship with those from others so that they can see how the claims of Christ and the lordship of Christ transcend and correct all of their more particular claims. There's history here. I note in the paper that when the WCC was founded, William Vissertehooft, who worked through the 30s and 40s and became the first general secretary of the WCC, one of his main points as he saw what was happening in Europe was that he felt it was imperative to gather Christians from different countries and nationalities and settings because of the need to say together, you can't ever have the gospel captive to any particular country and ideology, which is what he saw happening in the National Church of Germany at that time. So my question here is that message, which I think is a biblical message, is it one that can urgently answer the question, what for? What is Christian unity for in our particular context today? Now I've got a final reflection, and then I think at about 25 minutes, we will come to our close, Jonathan. The great advantage of ecumenism or the search for Christianity in the digital age is that these means of communication have the power to move freely across all the boundaries of nation and ideology and geography, denomination, culture. This is the great new thing that's happened in the digital age, and why those of us who are concerned about Christianity have to think hard about how does this gift and this capacity, how should we regard it? How can it be used? But we also see tensions and dangers. We see countries, I think of China, for instance, going to great extents to control strictly their digital communication. We saw recently how when there was unrest in Iran, that was widespread, the regime closed down all internet for a whole week in order to control it. We of course see the ways in which some regimes, Russia comes to mind, have used digital means to interfere in other countries and to advance their own particular agendas. Now, typically we regard these as political problems, but I'm wondering whether as Christians, we need to see such repressive political steps as presenting spiritual challenges to the cause of Christian unity. I think we need some deeper theological reflection about how we understand both the promise and then the tensions around digital communication when we think of Christian witness and when we think of the call to unity. I wonder whether in the digital age, there's a new application for the verse from John 8:32, you will know the truth and the truth will make you free. Those are the reflections I wanted in order to start what I hope will be a rich discussion. I look forward to this, and Jonathan, I hope that's a helpful beginning. So thank you. Again, I want to say how much I respect the work of Aqueduct, the work that Jonathan and his colleagues are doing. I am so grateful to them, grateful to God for your courage in really exploring the call to Christian unity in today's world and to invite voices like mine into this. I've been so privileged to be close to you, to be in dialogue with your board, and to be invited to events such as this. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wesley Granberg-Michaelson. I am so grateful for your presence and deeply honored. Thank you so much. I would like, again, to applaud and say thank you so much for those introductory comments. That'll get us off on exactly the right foot. This is a little unconventional, but I want to make a couple introductions. So I'm just going to do a quick screen share here with you. So not only are we extremely honored to have with us Wesley Granberg-Michaelson, but I'd also like to make sure that you are aware of one another. David Baer is with us, Director for Theological Education Initiative for the United World Mission and former President Overseas Councils. Liberato Bautista, did I pronounce that correctly? Levi Bautista, Assistant General Secretary for the United Nations Ministry, is with us. Thank you very much. Patrick Conley is with us, host of the Rediscover Hour at the Relevant Radio from Minneapolis. Aaron Aim, did I get your last name pronounced correctly, sir? Is that Aim? Director of Research and Education at Christ Church, Jerusalem. Yep, everybody go ahead and just find your mute button so that you can speak freely. We don't have Wonsak Ma with us. Oliver Mahan is with us, Professor of Clinical Mental Health and Counseling and Vice President for Institutional Effectiveness at Pentecostal Theological Seminary. And Gordon Smith, President and Professor of Systematic Theology and Spiritual Theology at Ambrose University, is with us. We're extremely grateful that you are also here. Dr. Brian Stanley, Professor of World Christianity and Director of the Center for the Study of World Christianity and the Study of Divinity at the University of Edinburgh, and also Gina Zerlo, Co-Director of the Center for the Study of Global Christianity at Gordon Conwell Seminary and co-author of the World Christian Encyclopedia. We also have a number of my students who are joining us, and I'm very grateful that they can listen in. So we have a marvelous opportunity to make some headway. I would invite your comments and interaction with Dr. Wesley Granberg-Michaelson.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Wesley very much for the presentation and maybe underline the importance of two things he's said. One, I think, is the need for a complete reimagining of ecumenism from the dimensions and trajectories it has had for most of the last century. It needs to be reimagined to fit the transformed landscape of Christianity today. One example of that, we had a paper in our own Center for the Study of World Christianity just on Tuesday about new churches in Glasgow, the largest city in Scotland. Since 2000, there have been 110 new churches planted in Glasgow. Half of those are African churches. And that now makes new churches the second largest category of church in the city of Glasgow after the national church, the Church of Scotland. Yet in terms of ecumenical relationships, virtually nothing is happening between those African churches and the historic mainline churches. I think that's a good example of what Wesley was talking about. We're not really capturing that dimension in our current ecumenical structures. The second thing I'd really want to underline is the importance of youth perspectives. If you look at the history of the ecumenical movement, to some extent it arises out of missionary movements, but I think even more specifically, it arises out of student movements. The universities were really where young Christian people began to question denominational boundaries and structures, to meet together for prayer, fellowship, and witness. That fed into the Great Edinburgh Conference of 1910, and from those student movements, the student volunteer movement, and ultimately the various movements that came to form the WCC came into existence. So I think there's been a tendency perhaps over the years for older church and mission leaders to take control of a movement, but the heart of it originally, I think, was a vision from young people who were impatient with narrow boundaries. So I think those are the two things I want to underline. like others, I'm sure all sorts of questions spring to mind. Maybe I could just stick to two. I think the first one would be, how would Wesley's proposals, either or both of them, stimulate local ecumenism?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think the day is past when bodies such as the WCC could expect to be noticed and heard in terms of internationalist thinking on politics, society, and so on, in the way that they were after the Second World War. Nobody takes very much notice now of what the WCC says. And I think if ecumenism is to be visible, it has to be above all at local level. That Glasgow example is a good example of that, that if people cannot actually see churches working together at local level, ultimately, I don't think ecumenism is happening. So I think whatever new ideas we come up with, and we've got two good ones here, we need to ask, how's it actually going to cash out in terms of local initiatives? Otherwise, I don't think we're going to get very far.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the second question, I'm not a social media person at all. I'm one of these Stone Age people who doesn't do social media, so I'm not the best person to comment. But it seems to me social media connect individuals to form virtual communities. Humanism, to my mind, is not primarily about connecting individuals, but about connecting existing Christian communities, churches and congregations, to ensure that together they exemplify the unity and wonder of the body of Christ. So I just wonder how we make that leap from social media as a means whereby random individuals decide to form virtual communities to wider bodies.
Well, first of all, I'm very grateful for Dr. Stanley's comments and questions. Brian, you've, I mean, I would expect, I would expect observations like this from your work at the Center for World Christianity at the Divinity School at Edinburgh, and you're right on target. Your first example in your plea to reimagine ecumenism, in the example from Glasgow, I could not agree more. I don't like to always make references to things I've written, but the book I wrote, From Times Square to Timbuktu, the post-Christian West meets the non-Western church, is precisely on that tension. And in Europe, in North America, the migrant church is a driving force of spiritual life. And you're exactly right that it is largely disconnected from ecumenical structures. We've tried to address that somewhat in the Global Christian Forum, and also in Christian churches together in the USA. It is urgent. It is not at all easy, but I often like to say that the big shift in Christianity today is that it has become, as Andrew Walls first said to me, it's become a non-Western religion. And this is causing a major shift from Christianity that's been for 400 years shaped by the culture of Western culture and the Enlightenment. But that dialogue between Western and non-Western Christianity is something now you can have around the corner. You can have right in your own neighborhood. And I think it's the most urgent dialogue and the most urgent ecumenical challenge. So I completely agree. I'm really intrigued by your emphasis on youth involvement and youth perspectives, Brian. Typically, when people recite the history of the ecumenical movement, they talk, of course, about the Edinburgh Mission Conference, World Mission, and then they talk about the history of faith and order, and they talk about the history of life and work as kind of the three streams that flowed into the ecumenical movement in the 20th century. I think you're exactly right that that the role of students is all in that search is often overlooked, and I think highlighting that is really important. I would relate that to your second question. I think you're quite right in saying, social media primarily connects individuals. Not all, but you've got examples of how organizations, find connections on social media, but yeah, generally. My sense is that we need a grassroots resurgence of ecumenical encounter across our different tribes and our different denominational bubbles. And that's got to begin to happen first between individuals. And I think in the student movement, that's what was happening. And then it's got to bubble up to affect the organizations which become the primary players. So that's at least how I might think about that second question you raised. And the first question, I'd only say I couldn't agree more. Despite my time serving as staff in the World Council of Churches and on its central committee in the past, I think we are at a point where we've got to reimagine ecumenism, and it has to have local expression. You find some examples of that, but if it doesn't take root there, it's not going to be very meaningful. So thank you very, very much, Brian. Those would be my responses.
Thank you.
Other comments, please go ahead.
So I just finished this book that some of you might be familiar with, the World Christian Encyclopedia, 3rd edition, 1,000 pages on the status of Christianity around the world.
Congratulations.
And thank you. And a lot of things struck me over the last 5 years working on this project, and one of them was media. So if you're familiar with the 1st and 2nd editions of the text, especially the 2nd edition, David Barrett included a lot on media. What do Christians do with the media in every country of the world? It really was quite an undertaking to figure out really it was radio ministries was the main thing working in the 60s, 70s, 80s. And so I inherited this book that had been written in the 60s and updated a little bit in the 90s in terms of the text, was published in 2001. And of course, we all know what happened with media between the 90s and today. And so I'm staring at this manuscript thinking, what are we going to do with media? Because media is not a thing that you can write about in the same way anymore, because it's everywhere. We're inundated with it. Our lives revolve around it. It's in my back pocket, literally in my phone every day. And there are places around the world we all know where there's more, people have access to cell phones more than they have running water, right? Yeah. And so sadly, what I did for the World Christian Encyclopedia is that I cut it, all of it. And there's hardly any treatment of media and Christian use of media and changes in relationship to media around the world, because it was too big. It was just like this woolly mammoth subject that, me and my team didn't quite have the capacity to tackle. And that's a real shame. And I think that points to, I think what a lot of us are saying here is, a lack of, I don't know if it's theological engagement about what Christians are doing with media. And especially when we get to the conversation of ecumenism, the digital age and media, that's like 2 strikes, that we're not thinking a lot about new ways of doing ecumenism, and we're not thinking a lot of ways of in new ways of what to do with media. So that's just an observation, I suppose, after undertaking this project, that the conversations about ecumenism, we did include ecumenism in the book, and we built off of what was in the 1st and 2nd editions to see where ecumenical networks are growing. And I was actually pretty surprised to see evangelical Pentecostal groups either creating their own ecumenical networks or even joining existing ecumenical networks around the world. So I think Wes is right that in general, independent Pentecostals, AICs don't tend to be groups that favor ecumenism. But I did see a slight trend in that direction after working, on the encyclopedia. So I think that's an encouraging thing. But I think that also ties into the lack of youth engagement, because another one of the trends happening in Christianity in the West, at least, is this deinstitutionalization of Christianity. That a lot of young people, they don't want to give their money to, a mainline church building to upkeep stained glass windows. They want to give their money directly to organizations that, work in poverty relief or whatever it is, building wells, places. And so if the ecumenical movement, it's so institutionalized, but now we have a whole generation of young Christians who are disaffiliated from the institutional body. There is a lack of connection between these young people and the ecumenical movement as a whole. And this points to what Wes and Brian were saying about it being a student kind of grassroots movement and then became institutionalized. So how do we revive what, Wes's question, new methods of ecumenical engagement have to be grassroots, I think is the way forward. But so that's kind of one thing. And then the social media piece, I spent a lot of time on social media, maybe because I'm a millennial. That's like in my nature, I have to, required. So I spent a lot of time on social media, and I actually encourage all of my students, I teach here at Gordon Conwell, to get on Twitter and to see what people are saying on Twitter and to join conversations on Twitter. And because it's a way that you can expose yourself to world Christianity, really, and expose yourself to people who don't look like you, who don't think like you, who are of your faith or aren't of your faith. And it is individualistic, but so are Christians now. I mean, in the West, I think because of this deinstitutionalization, there's a lot of, well, it's me and Jesus and we're good. So why not create a more, I'm kind of thinking out loud here. These are kind of half-baked thoughts. So don't put this on Twitter, I guess. Now that I'm speaking, why not have a kind of ecumenism that is more individualistic? Using a tool like Twitter where we can create purposeful, hashtags or groups or whatever it is to create ecumenical engagement that way, beyond the surface level of, I follow the Pope on Twitter and I'm a Protestant and he's a Catholic. Like, that's ecumenical in some way. But, a lot of Protestants don't follow the Pope on Twitter and don't, aren't listening to what other groups are saying. And that's a really basic entry, I think, for ecumenical engagement in the social media world. I think there are opportunities there, but people either think it's trivial or I don't want to scroll through Twitter, but you can curate what you see on social media in specific ways. So I think there actually is potential there, but I haven't seen anyone doing a lot of critical thinking about how to actually make it work. So that's just some thoughts for more conversation.
Well, Gina, I am so grateful. You are really one of the experts. I have not seen the third edition. I have read about it. I'm anxious to actually see it. The work you have done is spectacular, but I had no idea about what you have just shared concerning the treatment of social media. And the fact that it was just too big to handle. So I think my first challenge is, well, how are we going to do the fourth edition?
Please don't. I can't. I get that question a lot, and you can think about it, but I'm not going to think about it yet.
But I think there's an urgent need to really figure out what's happening and figure out how do we think about social media and how do we engage in it, and how do we see the trends that are happening. I mean, just anecdotally, I've observed the way in which the rise of digital communication has changed the way denominations communicate, has changed the way different organizations communicate. They've tried to figure out how do we use this tool in an organization that typically is structured in a pretty hierarchical way. So I think there's a huge discussion to be had there. and you could contribute a lot. The other observation I'd make is that I think it's pretty interesting that I would talk about my use of Facebook, of Facebook, and wanting to have Facebook, and you would talk about Twitter. I think that exactly demonstrates our generational difference.
Yep, and my students down the hall will be talking about Snapchat or something else that I've never heard of.
Yeah.
Right.
Very good. Thank you very much. So panelists, do you want to respond to the proposals, the specific proposals that have been placed out on the table by our speaker? Do you want to address any of those side questions? Do you want to give us a brainstorm about what ecumenism might look like in your institutional context?
Yeah, I think I can, if it's all right, I'd like to jump in a little bit too. Just to respond to what Gina was saying, a lot of what she was saying, I think also expresses some of the thoughts that I had in my own head about it, in terms of we have a lot of existing fora already for social interaction, social media, that sort of thing, including, there's been online forums with Christian dialogue, and that's both ecumenical, but also reaches beyond the realm of the Christian faith as well. And that's probably been going on for at least 20 years, that there have been those sorts of things. And I guess I'm a little hesitant to say that the introduction of a new social media platform on which to specifically spur on ecumenical efforts and everything like that, you would get only specific people who are interested in that, which is a good thing. I don't want to say that, but I don't know that it would be the widespread kind of, it wouldn't necessarily, in my own work with younger generations, I don't know that it would be widespread embraced in a widespread way. And so a little bit of hesitation there. Also knowing that on Facebook, Twitter, even to an extent, Instagram, and I'm just a newbie into Snapchat. I just got on this last Christmas, so I'm trying that out rather unsuccessfully right now. But I guess to come back to a question is that underpins some of the two proposals that are out there for Dr. Granberg-Michaelson. I'm just wondering, what exactly is the end game? In other words, what are we shooting for? What would be qualified as success in terms of furthering ecumenical efforts through either one of the proposals, or just in general, what your ideas are in terms of, what would be unity? What would be Christian unity? What would that look like? Would it simply be a matter of understanding one another, or would it be something deeper, more visible than that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think I'm grateful, Patrick. I'll offer my response, and I appreciate your hesitation about a new platform. I think these are discussions that a lot of people need to be engaged in to really think about what's feasible, what might work. But I like your question about success or the end game. What are we after? And I'd answer it in two ways. The first is that I see the real need as Brian Stanley said at the outset of our dialogue, for reimagining the whole ecumenical task today, and for re-engaging the existing ecumenical structures have done tremendous amount in 70 years. Are no longer engaging even their member churches, much less congregations and much less individual members, in the ecumenical task in a way which once happened. And so there has to be a new ecumenical engagement at a grassroots level that particularly finds ways to express itself amongst youth. I think if we're going to have the hope of a future where we won't simply go forward in our individual Christian tribes with little cooperation or appreciation of one another, It's got to happen amongst youth. So my first kind of answer to your question is I would pray for and hope for the mechanisms, whatever they may be, that re-engage youth in that biblical calling. And then the second question you point to, you know, I don't have a clear answer to what embodied forms this takes. I know it has to be incarnate. There have to be visible ways that people can feel and point to. And I can think of, and you know, you're not going to get like, well, for instance, attempts at denominational mergers and things like that. I'd have to say they're largely irrelevant, even though I helped engineer one. I think that's not what I'm thinking of, but I am drawn to visible encounters where people from different faith traditions are in public fellowship and engagement with one another, and then are acting together in the world. I could think of some examples. These aren't things that have a high and heavy institutional structure, but are examples. And I'm very interested in what Taizé is doing, not just at Taizé, but the things they sponsor around the world. But very successful in drawing young people into this, you know, into a visible expression of worship together, and then often some related outreach. It's things like that I would hope would be expanded on an exponential level. So those would be my two answers, Patrick.
Can I offer an example from Jerusalem?
Please.
Okay. So obviously, in the Middle East, it's from the media side, it might look like a realm of lots of tension, and none of us all get along. And sometimes that actually is quite true. However, we decided that we wanted to meet some of our local brothers and sisters in other countries that we normally didn't have access to. So we had a conference in Jerusalem where we invited Iranians and Iraqis, Kurds, Turks, Moroccans, Jordanians, Lebanese, and we brought them to Jerusalem. We asked them, please tell us what Jesus is doing in your country. We didn't talk about denominations, so we didn't look at Armenians and go, oh, here are the Orthodox. Please tell us what Orthodoxy is like. We looked at people in terms of Armenians, Persians, Turks, and it was a week-long conference. It was absolutely fantastic. We heard some incredible stories. When you turn the TV on, you look at the Middle East and think everything's dark. All we saw was light. It was unbelievable. The practical example that ended up happening, Patrick, is this was in 2012, and we've been doing it every 2 years since. ISIS swept through the Middle East and did some nasty things, and the Yazidis, as a large people group, migrated north and fled into what essentially is Kurdistan, or northern Syria. So we sent, because we had built some contacts, because we had made some friends, because we knew some of the people who were on the ground, we sent people from our community, so Messianic Jews, these are Israelis, Israeli Jewish Christians, Arab Christians, Gentile Christians. We sent them armed with as much American dollars as we could. They went into Turkey, smuggled across the border, and they bought tents and blankets for Yazidis. Mm-hmm. So it can engage ultimately in some sort of practical example, and it was an absolute blessing. What in terms of some things that you've mentioned, Dr. Granberg and Dr. Stanley, trying to engage the local level, you mentioned that Christianity is becoming largely African. We noticed that particularly in our Anglican world. I noticed from this panel, we haven't got anyone from Africa here. How do we engage Africa? They're going to be the majority part of Christianity going forward. Now, they've all got cell phones. Funny thing about poverty, you can go and talk to a church in Cambodia, which I've done, and you can stand in a room which is essentially 4 poles and a thatched roof, and there's sand, and there's no furniture, but everyone's got a cell phone with unlimited data, and you're scratching your head trying to figure out how they're charging these devices.
Yep.
So they have it, they have the device, but how do we engage them? For me personally, I'm involved with a little deaf community on my phone. I don't speak deaf, but we can communicate with each other through a WhatsApp channel, and we send prayers, we send blessings, we just wish each other Shabbat Shalom. I wish each other Shabbat Shalom to whoever is out there. Most of these guys are Africans.
Yeah.
And I've only met one of them.
Yeah. Aaron, I am so moved by that story about your conference, and I'd like to know more. It reminds me of what we do at the Global Christian Forum.
Okay.
Some of you would know this. We start every meeting bringing the participants in small groups to sit and have each one share personally their story of their journey with Jesus Christ. And to give them the opportunity, so that you've got an Orthodox bishop and a Pentecostal pastor and a Lutheran, pastor like yourself, and an evangelical, all from different parts of the world, many of whom have never considered one another even as Christians. Roman Catholic bishop. And after that time of sharing, a whole new dynamic is created. Now, at our second global meeting, we tried to bring that to a question of saying, what is the story of Christianity within your country? Similar to sort of what you're doing. We didn't get as far that way, but the methodology is very similar to what you're doing here. Not talking about how do we bridge all these theological denominational differences, but start at the point of experience and witness in our journey and connect there. So I'm quite drawn to the example that you shared.
As evangelicals, we always love to have a proof text. Do it before you do anything. Quote a Bible verse, and we looked at Colossians 3, where Paul was encouraging the believers to put on compassion and gentleness and humility, and to bear with each other and to forgive each other, and overall this rapid in love, and this would be unity. Unity here, obviously, in what Colossians was talking about is behavioral, not theological. Obviously, there are some theological no-go zones, but largely it could be behavioral. And so for us, particularly in the Middle East, we do our best to get the Palestinians and Jews and Iranians and Persians, who would normally be warring with each other politically, to behaviorally work together to bring blessing to a very troubled part of the world.
Jonathan, this is Liberato.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for including me. In fact, I'm still wondering how I got to this distinguished group of panelists. I know about 4 of you, but the 2 of them are not here. I know Katerina very well. I know Dr. Wansuk Ma. We are both members of the Global Forum of Theological Educators. Of course, I know Dr. Wesley Granberg-Michaelson. He may not know me, but I was a delegate to the World Council of Churches Assembly in Vancouver, and from that time on, I am still a member of the advisory committee of the Central Committee of the World Council of Churches until today. And I worked with your colleague, Doug Leonard.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
We're just 2 floors away from each other here at the Church Center for the United Nations. And maybe my comments are at another track from where we have developed so far some of the notions, and these are, I have plenty of scribblings on your on the summary of your notes. They're very exciting. I was struck by your use of that map with respect to the geocenter of Christianity, and the fact that by the time you get to the 20th, 21st century, you are in sub-Saharan Africa, and therefore, when you're talking about for what are we doing this, and you pointed in the last paragraphs of your presentation precisely the challenges of these geographies, and therefore the geopolitics, the geopolitical import of what you're suggesting. These are the places of intractable wars. These are resource-challenged communities. These places continue to renegotiate their post-colonial status in the community of nations. Mm-hmm. And poverty and marginalization are happening. So even when we reimagine ecumenism as grassroots, the renegotiation of power relations among political entities, and I see that every day in my work as the representative of the United Methodist Church worldwide at the United Nations, the renegotiation of power among former colonial and post-colonial countries at the United Nations. And last year, the United Nations General Assembly just passed a resolution on how to deal with the world's problems in a digital age. And I think that it bears noting that that while you speak of media, I'm reminded of I think someone I claim to be ecumenical, but in the media world, I'm sure you may all remember Marshall McLuhan. Mm-hmm. The medium is the message. Yeah. And if social media, if information communication technologies are in fact the medium and the platform, it bears noting who controls the medium. Yeah, yeah. Who has access to the medium. And I think Aaron's characterization of rural areas and other places around the world in the global south where everyone has a cell phone is not to me an expression of wealth or access to the necessities, but it is a way for them to catch up with the global north. Otherwise they will be so marginalized in the trajectory and of information in such a knowledge and information society that we have. And therefore it bears noting to me that access to knowledge and information is in the language of international law is a basic human right. And therefore when you talk of access, you're talking about justice and equity. You're talking about making use of the medium so that it is a medium for justice, for peace, for security, for inclusion, for participation. It reminds me of that old ecumenical watchword of just participatory and sustainable society. And so how do we make use of the medium if we are going to reimagine ecumenism today, so that not only is the medium is the subject of a critical lens of access, of justice, and of equity, but the possibility, and in your paper, Wesley, you already mentioned some of it, the possibility that the medium will be hacked. Now, when I use the word hacked, I'm thinking of a very robust blog, Hacking Christianity. I don't know, some of you may have have entered that blog post, Hacking. So one of the major concerns of the United Nations about the digital age is how the medium has been used to foster racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, cyberbullying, intolerance, and hatred. So there will be a host of the protocol that you, Wesley, speak about. Will have to take those in consideration. Just one more last intervention here. When we're talking about the local and the global, I happen to think of the local and the global as simultaneous realities, and let me explain. Up until I was 35, I worked for the National Council of Churches in the Philippines. So Manila was my local. And I traveled to Geneva for WCC. I traveled to New York, and New York and Geneva were my global. The last half of my professional life, I've worked here in New York. I have been a representative at the UN for 23 years up till today. And New York is now my local, and Manila is my global. It's my local. I mean, it's my global. So to think of ecumenism reimagined as grassroots being, well, we have to go all the way to the global south. That to me is a deficient geopolitical framework, because it could also mean a neo-colonial mission and evangelistic work, and understanding the grassroots are in fact in need of this new ecumenism. I can tell you that the grassroots is far more ecumenical than the global. In fact, an abandonment of the global centers of the very values that mission has taught the South. And I'll end it with simply for you to imagine that the United Methodist Church today is challenged by the effect of mission work and our theology, and therefore our polity and theology and mission and structure is going to be in greater focus in May, and the prospect of a split within the United Methodist Church as a result of how we have looked at the global South in our mission and in our work. And so on that note, I bid all you to pray for my church, in where we are headed. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, sir. And so you know, Oliver McMahon has raised his hand when you're done.
Fine. I just want to say we are so privileged to have you as part of this discussion. Please greet Doug Leonard for me. And I'm so glad that you've brought this issue of local, global, and put it into a different way of thinking, which I think is so helpful. One other thing I want to comment, when I think of your 23 years of work and many of your colleagues, we've continually said that we have to reimagine how we think about the ecumenical task. But it is the case, you're right in the center of it, that in international settings, there is more openness to trying to think about religious and spiritual, not only values, but how those players enter into the whole civil arena globally. And there's a real need for a voice and a presence at that level. At the same time, when we're saying there has to be a re-envisioning, I'll just share with you and ask for prayer, actually. In 2 weeks, I'm going to be in Beirut at a meeting of 25 sort of ecumenical experienced leaders and so forth, mostly from the WCC, 2 former WCC general secretaries and so forth. And the task is to try to think about where the ecumenical movement is today. But most of the voices there are going to be those who are older folks who have had long history and who are really well established, but they're asking the question, what now? And I don't know what I'm even going to say in that space, but how should I put it? It's not an either or. We've got to re-envision how we think about the ecumenical task, and we have to emphasize how it has to happen at our grassroots level. You rightly say it's happening far more than we recognize. At the same time, we have to give space for Well, we have to enter into the space that's being provided in global fora for a religious voice. And so how we do that, I think, is a real challenge.
Just a quick one. I know that the time, but as a good example is that the faith expressions in the grassroots are definitely in need of a global platform and a global audience, because that to them is a justice issue. That their issues of marginalization and injustice and wars there is are in need of a global platform. So I agree that the international arena plays a major role. But if from the point of view of missiology, the grassroots is in fact the field that we need to be, to be addressing. That to me harkens back a colonial model.
Well, it's a great honor and privilege to be with everyone and to serve on the panel. Been here at the Pentecostal Theological Seminary. It's the seminary of the Church of God, headquartered in Cleveland, Tennessee, and we're here in Tennessee. And I know Liberato and Gordon, and it's good to be with you all and meet everyone else. And it's a great presentation, great discussion. I also serve as a member of the Board of Commissioners for the Association of Theological Schools, ATS, and member participant for the Global Forum for Theological Education. And I know Gordon and Liberato are, and as well. And we do a lot of stuff on the web as an educational institution. All of our degrees are on the web. We have students from around the world, synchronous and asynchronous, and we're regionally accredited by ATS, and et cetera. I think it's important to talk about the web, and not just online, not just digital. The web as and I think it relates to the South. On the web, you can't immediately tell whether someone's rich or poor, black or white, or from what country. You're just engaged. I think one thing about the web is a great flattener. It dismantles all of the institutionalism. A lot, even ecumenism, approaching, getting together, talking is a very privileged enterprise. And a slice of this is the world of non-privilege. But as our brother from Israel said, you'll find not just a cell phone, but a smartphone everywhere. And it's really leveled out the economic playing field, if you will. And I think that's the great dismantling that the web has done. Not just a communication tool, but it's really changed the landscape of the way we look at power and privilege. And to be able to fly across the world and sit in a room with wonderful people and develop conversations is really a privilege. And does that represent ecumenism? I think a web-based engagement might more reflect Christian unity and ecumenism.
Hi, I know you guys can't see me, which is annoying, but so I study with Professor Brian Stanley at Edinburgh, and my project is looking at young people in ecumenism. So I think both of these ideas are really interesting. I'll start with the idea of the Youth Day. I completely agree with both you, Wesley, and I think Gina picked up on it as well, that young people usually get involved in ecumenism because of mission. So I think if we are looking at doing a kind of bringing together larger ecumenical youth day, I think there needs to be a clear purpose. And I think the difference of like Taizé and the big Catholic World Youth Day is that groups would usually attend these these initiatives. So like a group of young people will go to Taizé and they very much know what they're getting. Whereas my master's dissertation was looking at the Edinburgh 2010 Centenary Assembly. And they found it really, really hard to engage young people. And they did a multimedia competition, they did a writing essay competition. But I think because people were going individually, young people find that really daunting. So I think that there needs to be a way for young people to meet each other first before they go into something like this. And also, I think a lot of like ecumenical initiatives for young people now kind of see them as like, oh, we want to listen to you, but I think they feel a bit like token young people, like they're just taking diversity quotas. Whereas if we go back to historically, like what Professor Stanley was saying, when we look at the SCM, young people were really the initiators, and they were doing theology themselves. They were pushing the boat. So how do we find a way to make them feel like they're really being heard and that they're really the initiators here? Secondly, just a few comments on the idea of Facebook. I would just like to propose out there, if Facebook is working as an established platform for connecting people ecumenically, why do we need to make another one? I think a lot of the time people think that social media is like a self-regulating, communicating angel, kind of sent from above to save us all. But actually, after working with social media company for a summer, it takes a lot of work and a lot of regulating. Looking at some of the groups I'm involved in on Facebook and things like that, usually you kind of have like two platforms. You've got like a page which will have public information, and then you have groups. And if the groups aren't regularly maintained, they go stale very, very quickly, or they'll be taken over by one more active or kind of, established person who already has an opinion that they want to give. So that needs to be beared in mind, that I think if you want to do a new platform, it will be a lot of work, and it will be very, very difficult to do that. And just one more point is that also social media is cultural, so people from around the world use it very differently. So here, Twitter, and here in America, Twitter is very much used by church clergy and like academics. Instagram is used more for self-promotion, and Facebook is used more for individual communication. But that's different around the world. So people from South Africa will use it differently to people from India. Like, kind of manners and customs are different on it. And also, Aaron and I agree that there's the idea of everyone has a cell phone and everyone has social media, but not everyone uses it in the same way, and not everyone has the same sort of access to it, in the sense that if we were going to have a global social media, what we're going to look at language, like everyone's going to probably have to speak English. People there will have to write, whereas around the world a lot of people actually send voice notes to each other instead of texting now. So yeah, that I've spoken quite a lot, so I'll just leave you with those kind of ideas. Thank you.
Victoria, you've given us a lot, more than we can actually respond to specifically, but everything will be transcripted, and we will put that in a report. So you've given us a lot, but we will have a mechanism to be able to grab a hold of that. Thank you.
Great, thanks.
Perhaps we could have closing comments from Gordon Smith, David Baer, if either of you wish to make a statement as well.
Sure, very briefly, just to say I serve as a university president, and I think the upcoming Prayer for Christian Unity Week is a spectacular opportunity for us to do things locally, and we will be doing that in 2 weeks. And I can trust the young people, the university kids between the ages of 18 and 23, forgive me for referring to them as kids, but they're the age of my grandchildren now. I can trust them to let the good news go out through social media with what is happening on our campus as we welcome Catholics, Orthodox, and others to our campus for that week. Secondly, as Oliver mentioned, and David Baer's part of it as well, the Global Forum on Theological Education is a reminder to us that on some level, everything pivots on those people that give leadership to the faith communities of which we're a part. And if emerging pastors and priests of congregations and faith communities don't get it, it really shuts it down. So I'm hugely committed, as I'm sure others of you are as well, to fostering ways in which theological seminaries can think very creatively and intentionally about how we foster ecumenical awareness for emerging leaders of faith communities. I'll leave it at that.
It's an extremely important statement. David Baer, do you wish to address the group?
Just to endorse Gordon, what Gordon has said on several counts. I would have wanted to use words as eloquent as those to say very much the same thing about the role of seminaries and a number of other points he touched upon. Maybe I'll just add to that, in light of some of the conversations we've had about equity and power arrangements and so forth. I have had the privilege of serving for about 4 or 5 years with the Global Forum for Theological Education. It's actually been a life-changing experience for me to be on the executive committee and to participate in the shaping of the 2 fora that we've done and the 2 conferences that we've done so far. One of the things that I think we've all learned, but I have certainly learned in spades, is that the higher up the technological pillar we climb, the easier it is to end up with a conversation partners like those of us whose beautiful faces are on my screen this morning, where our composite skin color is probably beige, not because we want to be unrepresentative, but because it's natural to be unrepresentative unless, as we've had to learn in the GFTE, at every step, we exert great effort and go to great expense to make sure that our conversation partners are in fact globally representative. It doesn't occur in nature. It has to be forged as a matter of deep principle from the outset. I know we all know that, so let me just give this as testimonial to say in the GFT experience, we've just seen that in, so to speak, in full color. It's hard work, and it doesn't work to invite deeper representation in the 3rd or 4th inning, if I may use a baseball analogy from my own country of origin, unless it's representative from the outset, it won't be embraced and it won't become representative.
Yep.
Good. Thank you very much. Wesley Granberg-Michaelson, we are extremely grateful for your presentation. Maybe if you have any final comments you wish to make, go ahead and make those. And if you'd be willing to close us in prayer, that would be great.
Well, I'm just very grateful for this time. I've learned a lot. I've found some new partners and friends. I have 2 observations, Jonathan. One is that I think of all the discussions I've ever been in, there's been more attention to the question of social media, the digital age, the role of ecumenism within this new climate. I've never been in a discussion that has had this level of interchange. I think we've raised some really fascinating questions. I just tried to stimulate things by throwing a few things out there. I think we've really gone down the road. My real concern is who can pick this up? There's a real dialogue to be had here. And I'm wondering where and how that will happen. But I'm very grateful that this topic was chosen and that we've gotten as much onto the table as we have. The second thing, I've noticed that at least 5 of you have mentioned the work of the Global Forum on Theological Education, which is an organization I'm familiar with, although I've never participated directly. I've heard often about its work. It strikes me that there might be an opportunity for the Global Forum on Theological Education and the Global Christian Forum to discuss ways in which there might be some joint endeavor around some of these questions. That's at least something that I think would be worth exploring. There's so much else that has been shared. I'm glad that there's going to be a record of this. But Jonathan, I thank you, and I thank the panelists for an initiative that I really do think takes forward an urgent discussion for the sake of Christ's witness and the unity of Christ's body in our day.
Thank you. Would you be willing to close us in prayer, sir?
Please join me. Please join me in prayer. Our gracious God, we are humbled to be able to be in your presence and in the presence of one another in this way. We are grateful for the way in which your grace and truth has touched each of our lives and has beckoned us to step forward into work and action that furthers the unity of your body and the witness of your church in the world. we pray that we would be faithful to the callings we've received, and that we would be open to the promptings of your Spirit, which have come through this exchange that we've had, that we would follow, and that we would take the next steps that would be in your will and in your purpose. Guide us now in all we say and do, that it may be for the honor and glory of you. We pray this in the name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Shabbat shalom, everybody.
Shabbat shalom.